time. Thank you all for joining us for another episode of the Crow Canyon webinar series. We just hit 5 months. It's just incredible the response that we've gotten to these. So thank you so much for coming. And thanks to Katie Richards, who's joining us today to talk about her really groundbreaking research on Fremont archaeology. I'll give a little introduction to Katie in a minute, but first I want to do some of our normal slides here. I want to progress through my slides. Hold on. Give me a moment. Here we go. First, I want to thank everybody who's making this possible, and especially Dylan Schwent and Taylor Hasbrook. Dylan is behind the scenes running all of the tech for us. He's really figured out this webinar system in an amazing way. So thanks, Dylan. And Taylor has been organizing and coordinating all of these webinar series, and we really couldn't do it without Taylor's help. We also couldn't do it without support, and we've recently received a great grant through the Colorado Humanities and National Endowment for Humanities, supporting this webinar series and enabling us to keep bringing these fabulous lectures like Katie's today. For those of you who are joining us maybe for the first time, I just want to give you a little introduction to Zoom and how you can get involved in this talk. The first thing is you'll have talking heads. You're probably seeing mine right now, floating in the corner of your screen. Well, if my head is in your way, like it might be right now, you can minimize the head by clicking the little narrow bar. You can move the head by just clicking and dragging. If you are on mobile, you can swipe left or right and get to where you can see the slides that I'm talking about now and that Katie will be talking about soon. If you want to ask questions, we'll be taking questions in two ways. If you're joining us on Zoom, the key is to click the Q&A button. It'll be at the bottom of your screen if you're on a computer. If you're on your mobile device, tap your screen and it should appear. Ask your questions through the Q&A. I'll be taking them throughout. If there's a particularly salient question, I might interject and ask Katie. Otherwise, we'll try to get to all of the questions at the end. If you're having difficulties, you can head over to our live stream at Facebook. And we've got a nice quick link now. You can go to crowcanyon.org/Facebook, and you'll get right to our Facebook page, and you'll see the live stream right there on the page. You can always ask questions in the chat for Facebook, and we'll get to those questions as well. And as always, you can subscribe to us on YouTube, crowcanyon.org/YouTube, and we'll be posting Katie's talk within 24 hours up on YouTube. So if your connection's real bad and you want to just catch it later, check it out on YouTube. You know, the mission of Crow Canyon Archaeological Center, for those of you who haven't gotten the opportunity to visit us, is to empower present and future generations by making the human past accessible and relevant through archaeological research, experiential education, and American Indian knowledge. And the speaker that you're going to hear from today represents one of the ways in which we really meet that mission. Katie is the current Lister Fellow at Crow Canyon. The Lister Fellowship has been going on for many years and provides important financial support for graduate students who are finishing their degrees. And we're really pleased to have Katie giving us a lecture in this extremely public forum about her research, really connecting the past in the Four Corners region to the broader Southwest. We've got a couple of upcoming webinars that are not to be missed. Next week, we'll have Dr. Jim Allison from Brigham Young talking about the recent archaeological research that BYU's been doing in Southeast Utah. That's a Four Corners lecture. And then the following week, we've got another one, Chaco's Monumental Roads, New Fieldwork and Insights by Rob Weiner. So please join us for both of those in the next couple of weeks. Now I want to introduce my friend and colleague and the current Lister Fellow at Crow Canyon, Katie Richards. Katie's a doctoral candidate at my alma mater, Washington State University, and does research that focuses on the social and political organization of the Fremont people in the relationship between the Fremont and the Pueblo cultures in the Central Mesa Verde region. As a Lister Fellow, her analysis of Fremont culture is dovetailing with Crow Canyon's current research projects, including the Northern Chaco Outliers Project. Katie is looking at the relationship between the Fremont culture area and the Pueblo culture area to the south. Her work combines fresh theoretical frameworks, methodologically rigorous analysis of ceramics that we're about to see, and a multi-scalar analytical approach. And you actually can see it on your screen right now. Look at that real rigorous analysis of ceramics. So without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Katie's going to share hers. And thank you, Katie. Take it away.
Perfect. Oh, dang, what did I do? Share screen. I think I pushed a button. There we go. Okay, sorry about that.
Here it comes. Good.
Okay, let's go back up again. Okay, perfect. Thank you for that. Last picture was true science in action. And we'll be talking more about that and a lot of my ceramic analysis here in a minute. So thank you again for the introduction, Kyle, and thank you, Crow Canyon. I feel very honored to be the Lister Fellow for this year, and I've been very grateful for their support. Just as a quick introduction, yesterday I was at Fremont Indian State Park doing some research. It's located in central Utah, and here's a quick overview of the site at Fremont Indian State Park. And I had gone to the campground last night to spend the night there. And as it was getting dusk, I pulled out my laptop and started going through this presentation to make sure that I was ready. And I was sitting there alone in the campground, speaking to myself in the middle of the forest. And I realized two things. One, that as bizarre as that seemed, it was probably an apt way to prepare for this kind of presentation where I'm alone in a room speaking to you guys. And that second, there's probably a bunch of campers in central Utah who think they camped next to a crazy person yesterday who was just talking to herself. With that, though, Fremont Indian State Park seems like a very appropriate place to begin my presentation and discussion about Fremont. Fremont Indian State Park is located near Richfield, Utah, and if you're ever near there and you ever have a chance to go visit, just take it. It's an amazing little park. There's a lot of cool rock art. The site was initially found when they were building the I-70 corridor through central Utah. The Office of Public Archaeology was in charge of the archaeology of that excavation in that area. And during the project, the local came up to them and said, well, why aren't you excavating that site over there? And the directors, I don't think the site was in the project area, though I could be wrong about that. The directors went over and looked at that site, realized that it seemed to be a Fremont Village site, talked to UDOT, and UDOT said, oh, well, we were thinking of using that hill for gravel for the road. So you probably should excavate it. So they went through and they excavated it. And it turns out that it's probably one of the most, possibly arguably the most important Fremont village ever found. And just to give you a sense of what it looks like, this is what the site looks like. We have a map over on the left-hand side, and we have a model that is at Fremont Indian State Park that I took a picture of yesterday over here on the right. And on the majority of here, you have all these little tiny pit houses surrounding the edges of the site. And that's a pretty typical thing. You have these pit houses that are dug into the ground and are then roofed. That is where the majority of Fremont people lived in Fremont villages. You have in the center here, you have this here, and then it's over here, you have this central structure of some kind, probably a communal structure that was communally built, maintained, and used. You have on the other side of this little saddle here and over here in the red, on the right-hand side, you have this house that looks different and unusual. It's bigger than the other pit houses. It has cooler artifacts than the other houses. And it's been interpreted to be the house of the leader. Now, this unusual residence and this idea of having a communal structure at a Fremont village, pretty typical. In the middle of those, you have this flat area. And as you can see in the model, it's arguably the flattest area on the entire site because the site is a hill, meaning it's probably the easiest and maybe best place to build, yet nobody built there, which seems very intentional, like this intentional idea to leave this space blank to use as a communal plaza that people could gather. They could have rituals, ceremonies, meetings. You could do the activities of everyday life there together as a community. Ideas of having a plaza at a Fremont village is pretty common. So here's the interesting thing about Five Finger Ridge. is I said that everything is pretty typical. You have typical pit houses, typical unusual structure of a leader, a typical communal structure. Then why, if everything is so typical, is it one of the most important Fremont sites ever excavated? And the answer to that is going to tell you a lot about Fremont archaeology in general, especially for those of you who are archaeologists. And the reason is because it is the only fully excavated Fremont village. We have dozens of other villages that have been partially excavated, but this is the only one that has been completely excavated, meaning that it is giving us invaluable data, but also there's nothing really to compare it to because all we have are these partial excavations here and there. And that's one of our problems with Fremont archaeology, is being able to get this bigger, broader picture when all we have are small surveys here and small excavations there. Now, I really love Fremont. I'm very passionate about Fremont. My friends will tell you that I get very excited when I talk about them. And I think one of the reasons why is because Fremont, in many ways, seems like one of the underdogs of the Southwest. There's a couple, but Fremont seems very much like one of them. And the reason I say that is because of things like this, where we often just get left off the maps of the Southwest. On the left here, we have a map from Archaeology Southwest, and the northern extent is ancestral Pueblo. And the Fremont Ridge is way up here in Utah. And I will say Archaeology Southwest has done a fantastic job of promoting and educating people about Fremont. If this talk piques your interest at all, I highly recommend checking out their issue from a few years ago called Introducing to Fremont. I feel privileged to have been a very small part of that issue, but it's a fantastic discussion of a lot of the things I'll be talking about today. On the right here, we have a map from Encyclopedia Britannica, which again also ends with ancestral Pueblo, and we don't have anything with Fremont. And if Fremont is included on these maps, and I think from now on when I go to museums, I'm going to start taking pictures of all the maps, you get this little placate of Fremont written up here, and then like lines that go into the abyss that is north. So we're kind of left off a lot of things, and there is a reason for this. And part of that is understanding the origins of Fremont, and origins of Fremont research. And I'm going to talk about that very, very briefly. So when the Fremont were first beginning to be excavated in the early 1900s, you have individuals like Neil Judd, who excavated Pueblo Bonito. He also excavated a very important site in southern Utah called Paraguna. And what he says is that it's Pueblo, in fact, is definitely directly related to these Pueblo cultures. You have Noel Morris, who is also an important founder of Fremont archaeology, and he's also saying that, yeah, there's important aspects of Fremont that you see in Southwest culture. Unfortunately, due to a lot of reasons that I'm not going to get into unless people are really interested, eventually you kind of get this divide. You have Fremont archaeologists suggesting that instead of being related to the Southwest, that Fremont is actually a local manifestation. It is people who have always been there, growing, evolving, adapting, and changing to their environment. And it's the same types of people, it's this desert culture that you see over in the Great Basin as well. They have some slight ephemeral ties to the Southwest, but nothing substantial. And that's when you start seeing Fremont left off of Southwest maps. For the past 20 or 30 years or so, Fremont archaeologists have begun to really argue and suggest that Fremont should be reunited with the Southwest. We're part of the Southwest. We are Puebloan, in fact, as Neil Judd says. And the essence and the foundation and heritage of what Fremont really is has strong ties to the Southwest. And I'll be discussing a lot of that today. So I'm going to introduce kind of the main topic of this presentation, and that is, who were the Fremont? And this is a very complicated issue, and we're going to be skimming the surface in many ways about this, but hopefully I'll be able to pique your guys' interest, and likely I'm going to be asking and presenting more questions than I'm actually answering. But hopefully that will get you guys interested, and you will come back and listen when I finish my dissertation and I'm presenting the Lister Fellowship presentation, when I will hopefully have at least some answers to some of these questions. Okay, because I get asked this a lot, I just want to start with how Fremont got the name. I've been asked multiple times if Fremont is what they called themselves, and as many of you guys can probably imagine, no, Fremont is not what they called themselves. We actually have no idea what the Fremont people would have called themselves, or if you talk to people in this broad region we call Fremont, if they would have even seen themselves as being something that is coherent. Would they even felt that they needed a name for themselves? those are the kind of questions that we're trying to deal with and ask right now. There's likely multiple ethnicities, multiple linguistic groups that all existed within this area. The reason it's called Fremont is because Noel Morris, not to be confused with Earl Morris, who, if you're listening to Michelle Turner's talk, excavated at Aztec ruins. And I'm a little embarrassed to say that for the first couple months of my Fremont education, I thought they were the same person until I saw it spelled out and realized it was actually somebody else. But Noel Morris excavated in the Fremont River drainage back in, I think it was 1928. And when he was digging, he expected to find something that was Southwestern. And what he found instead was a culture that seemed to have very strong Southwest elements, but didn't fit in with any of the known Southwest cultures. And because he first discovered that and documented it in the Fremont River drainage, the term Fremont has just been adopted, and that's what we call it now. Now, I know that many of you, even those of you who study and are students of the Southwest, likely don't know much about the Fremont. So before we go any further, I want to just orient everybody in space and time so we all know what we're talking about. The Fremont occupied much of what is now the state of Utah. You can see these boundaries, they're dashed lines. Obviously, we don't have hard, fast boundaries. There is some intermixing and permeability in these different regions. It takes over most of Utah. We see a little bit into eastern Nevada, a little bit into western Colorado, and depending on the map and who you're talking to, you can also see extend possibly into Idaho and Wyoming. Down here, we have our Pueblo neighbors. We have the Virgin region over here, Canta, and the corner is Pueblo over here. So this is essentially what we're looking at. I'm going to be talking about a few different sites, and I just want to point them out now so we all know and are oriented. Wolf Village is one of them. It's located here on the southern end of the Utah Valley. Five Finger Ridge, that is where Fremont Indian State Park. That's the park that was built because of the excavation of Five Finger Ridge. That's located here. And then I'll be talking about these southern sites, Tarragona and the Tarrawan Valley sites, which are, as you can see, are really kind of the southern boundary here. And I'll talk about this later, but it's interesting because we're so close to different Pueblo groups, kind of this boundary, but there's different levels of intermixing. You'll see some more hard, fast boundaries, and you'll see some boundaries that are a little bit more permeable. Now, let's talk about time frame. When we're talking about chronology, there are some problems in Fremont, and we'll discuss those very briefly here in a second. So, depending on who you talk to and what you define as Fremont, you may start Fremont at a different time. Traditionally, Rich Talbot and others have started at around 1 AD because that's the first time you start seeing corn in the region. Recently, Jim Allison has redated that site and suggested that early corn site may not quite be AD 1, but might be more AD 100. And so if you think that Fremont starts with corn, you're going to start it at about AD 100. Interestingly, though, and I've been guilty of this as well, there's this AD 400 date that gets thrown around a lot. And I think I used it in my thesis, and I use it all the time. And I realized very sadly the other day that I actually wasn't entirely sure where it came from. And after talking to a couple other Fremont experts, we decided that it's probably, there's an early date on pottery from like the 60s and 70s that's about AD 400, and we think that might be where this AD 400 date is coming from. But again, it might not be the best data. None of us can quite pinpoint where it's coming from. The end date for Fremont is a little bit more secure. Sometime between AD 1300 and 1350, the region is depopulated at least by agriculturalists. So this is really the part. Oh, yes?
We've got a quick question about the area. Just can you point with your mouse sort of where Moab, Utah is, just to give people a sense of how close that is to the edge?
Oh, heavens.
It's just that they're south of Turner Look on the Colorado
Road.
Road.
Is it up here?
Yeah, just
like up here?
Yeah, just right about there. Cool.
Thanks for knowing where Moab is, Kyle.
yeah, you bet. And then you're a little muffled, so I've got one person asking for you to just slow it down just a touch. You're doing great.
Thanks, Kyle. I can definitely slow it down a little bit.
Very cool.
Okay, so the end of the Fremont region is a little bit clearer. So as I was saying, this is really the farthest north that you can farm in the Southwest. But that being said, if the climate's changing and the environment's changing, then that's going to change whether or not people can farm, whether the environment is useful to farming or not. And so at different time periods, as that happens, people are going to depopulate that area, or they're going to abandon farming in that area. And by about 1300 to 1350, we no longer have the hallmarks of Fremont that we see before them. And so that's the end of Fremont. Okay, let's talk about this chronology very quickly. We have a few issues here. So just a quick overview of dating methods, especially those used particularly in the Southwest. These right here are kind of our bread and butter of dating in the Southwest. First is dendrochronology. That is like the golden standard of dating methods. You do dendrochronology on beams. It's tree ring dating. We have some burn beams over here. We actually sent all of these to the tree ring lab at University of Arizona to see if we could get some dates, and we got a few. Dendrochronology is incredibly precise and can give you the exact year when a site was, when a tree was cut down, if you have the outer rings. Meaning that there are some sites in the Southwest where we know the year that construction began and the year that construction ended. That is incredibly specific. I had a class from a professor who does Northwest Coast archaeology, and he was saying that they were excited because they got this site dated within a couple hundred years. And he kind of rolled his eyes and looked at me and said, I know that's nothing for you guys in the Southwest, but I was really excited about it. And in the Southwest, we're incredibly spoiled to have this very precise dating. Unfortunately, the dendrochronology record isn't very well constructed for the Fremont region. So while we do have a few dendro dates, and we have people who are working on creating a better chronology and better dating for the Fremont region, we still can't really utilize the dendro date very much. The next is AMS, or accelerated mass spectrometry dating. And the important thing to know about this is that you can date very small samples, so such as a single kernel of corn. And so that means you can date things with a very short lifespan, like corn. And then the least desirable, and of course, then the kind that we mostly have used in the Fremont region over the decades, is C14 dating on wood charcoal. And this has a lot of issues. You can have issues with old wood. If you have a tree that's very old and you're dating the innermost piece of it, then you might have issues that you're dating a piece of wood that actually dates 100 years before the tree was cut down. Or if people are getting wood that's already been felled, then it could have already been down for a few years. There's a lot of issues that you kind of give these inaccurate dates. And unfortunately with Fremont, most of the dates that have been run are from C14 dating. However, Jim Allison has been trying to get new dates all AMS dates on corn, so we have a better idea of Fremont chronology. Okay, so I'm going to go over just a really brief overview of what kind of, I guess, Jim Allison's kind of revised chronology looks like. First, we have about 81,000, we have corn in the region. By about 82 to 300, we get the bow and arrow. By 86 to 700, we start getting plain pottery. And then by 88,000, you get this kind of classic Fremont village. And what it really looks like is that you have the introduction of corn. You have people living in maybe more ephemeral housing. They could be seasonally corny, maybe not fully dedicated to it. By about 8,600, it seems that there may be a little more sedentary, because you also have people creating pottery, and that usually indicates a little more sedentary lifestyle, as well as growing corn. And then we kind of see it as you have these kind of small changes. It's very dispersed. We don't have a lot of sites that date to pre-1000. They're just kind of people living in very dispersed settlements. And then all of a sudden at 81,000, you have this massive leap, and you have this massive change where people are now living in villages. People are aggregating into these village sites. You have pit houses that look more permanent, but then you also have surface architecture, which is mixed into that. They're no longer just making plain pottery, they're also making painted pottery. So you have this very dynamic and intriguing shift that happens around 81,000. And one of the questions that I want to deal with in my dissertation is why? Why do you get this sudden change in culture? And there's a couple of hypotheses that have been thrown out. I think one of the best is by both Jim Allison and Steve Blackson have suggested this, that maybe you're getting this insurgence of people from the Southwest moving into the Fremont region. That this area that was very sparsely populated is now becoming more populated with migrants from the Southwest, which would explain a lot of the change, that we suddenly start getting village life like you see in the Southwest. I mean, it's different, but it's still villages. You get surface architecture like you see in the Southwest. It's different, but it's still surface architecture. You get painted pottery like you see in the Southwest, and in many ways, it's not different, but then it becomes different. And I'll talk about that here in a minute. So the question then is, what is the insurgence for this change? What is the impetus for this change? Why, if people are moving, would they move? The population down in the Four Corners region at this time period is not overly populated. So it's not that overpopulation might be a reason that people would move into the Fremont region. Steve Lexon and Jim Allison have both suggested, and this is a little more controversial and something that I find very intriguing and would like to look into more in the future, but probably not necessarily looking into it for my dissertation, is this idea that not long after 1000, you see Chaco starting to move up into the northern San Juan, move up into that Four Corners area. And if people saw the writing on the wall, if they realized that's what was about to happen and they did not want to be part of Chaco, could they possibly be fleeing Chaco and moving just beyond the reach of it and creating something that, in essence, is very Southwestern heritage, but also shows a strong rejection of the Southwest? And we'll talk about how Fremont both looks very Southwestern, but in some ways shows a rejection of the Southwest and something that seems very distinctly Fremont here in a second. Now, in order to understand this kind of, oh, sorry, I forgot that I had this slide in here. This is Jim Allison looking at, this is his date on maize and corn at Fremont Village site. And you see that all of the Fremont Village sites, basically that he dated, this is AD 1000 right here, they all date post AD 1000. So that's that kind of jump right there into Fremont Village life. Okay, back on track to frontiers. Many archaeologists, for decades actually, Fremont archaeologists have suggested that we understand Fremont as a frontier. And frontiers literature is dynamic and rich and deep. And I feel like I'm probably going to butcher it by talking about it for about 30 seconds here. So if this is your theory, I apologize. I'm going to very quickly. But it kind of gives us an idea of the kind of dynamic processes that occur on a frontier. So Bradley Parker has said that frontiers are zones of interpenetration between two previously distinct peoples. So the Fremont region, there's obviously been a connection between Fremont and the Southwest for a long time because they're growing corn and they had to have gone up somewhere. And they have pottery before this 81,000 marker, and that probably came from the Southwest as well. But they're very isolated. They're still doing their own thing. They're not following all of the same progression patterns that you see in the Southwest. And so then at the point about 81,000, you have this interpenetration of these two cultures that were, in essence, basically distinct before. The thing that's really fascinating about frontiers literature is that it emphasizes the unique history of each frontier. You can't just say all frontiers are going to act like this. It's important and emphasizes the importance of looking at the history of all the groups involved and then how those things might interact and come together when two different groups come together. Frontiers are locations where identity and relationships are negotiated. They're locations of ethnogenesis, conflict, and innovation. So as you can imagine, if a group, say people from the Southwest, were moving into the Fremont region, they're not going to take their culture wholesale and just replicate it in the Fremont region. There are too many factors. The environment's different, the population density is going to be different. They have people already living there that they're going to have to learn how to live with or live in conflict with. And through those processes, they begin to negotiate and renegotiate their identities. And you have this ethnogenesis where new cultures and ethnicities and ideas start popping up and identities start popping up and are created in these zones. And as you can imagine, if perchance they are, say, fleeing Chaco, then that's also going to play an important role into who they become once they get into that Fremont region. And even if that's not the reason, whatever reason they have for coming in to this Fremont region is going to play an important role in what this new identity that they negotiate is going to look like. And that's why this literature is so dynamic and rich. And this aspect is particularly pertinent to this Fremont question, is because we're seeing, it looks like this integration of these two cultures and these two identities, and that becomes something new. And we're going to talk about that slowly. So first, I want to go over some basic questions of Fremont, basic foundations of what Fremont is. Because again, I know that many of you, even those of you familiar with the Southwest, likely are not familiar with Fremont. So, sorry, you drink really fast. First, they're agriculturalists. Now, this has been debated a lot, but as I define and many of my colleagues define Fremont are agriculturalists. They're growing corn, and that's one of the main hallmarks of being Fremont. They're growing corn and beans, and there is some evidence for squash. Squash doesn't preserve quite as well. We're not quite as dry as if you go further south in the Southwest. And so if they had squash, it's found in a couple sites, but the remains are perishable, so we don't necessarily see it at all sites. They've also done isotope analysis on human remains in the Fremont region, and those isotope analyses show that the Fremont people who lived in villages are relying on agricultural foods just as much as their Pueblo neighbors. So they're just as reliant on this food source as anyone in the Pueblo world. Okay, next, they also supplemented their diets with wild food sources. So you have them, if they're growing corn, they're also hunting deer and rabbits. We have evidence for fish and birds. So all of the wildlife that they would have around them, they're also hunting and eating those, and they're gathering wild plants as well, which is something you also see in the Pueblo Southwest as well. You see people utilizing the wild resources as well as these cold gyms. Okay, so where they lived, I talked about this a little bit when I showed you guys Five Finger Ridge. I believe both these pictures on the right are pit houses from Five Finger Ridge. And you can see this is what they look like archaeologically after we dig them. It's a hole in the ground. And we have these small post holes here. The typical pattern is to have 4 post holes, and then you'd have cross beams going across those, and then you'd have leaning beams forming the roof from the edge of the pit onto those cross beams forming the roof. And you could put plant material, and then you would put dirt on top of that. And these houses are very efficient. They stay warm in the wintertime as you're heating them. They stay cool in the summertime. And this is where the majority of Fremont people are living. You can see they have these little ventilation tunnels right here to allow air to circulate in. This is a central hearth right here. So the majority of Fremont people living here. Now, at the same time, at many Fremont Village sites, we also have these unusual residences. And these can take a number of different forms. One I showed you at Five Finger Ridge was just a big pit house with unusual artifacts. This one here is an adobe house. These are surface houses. So on the right, we have what is called Heartbreak Hotel from Nauthis Village in central Utah. And this is an adobe house with multiple rooms. And this is an unusual one because they don't normally have this many rooms. On the left, we have a very simplified version of a structure this is Wolf Village. This is kind of southern Utah Valley. And this is a fairly typical Fremont structure. It's a surface structure. It's made of adobe. You have a big room here where they would have lived, and a smaller room where they would have stored things, and a little doorway to get in between. And this made a lot of sense. And this is a site that I've worked on for years. One year we decided it would be a great idea to go north and just see what was there. And then the structure made no sense anymore. All of a sudden, instead of just having these 2 rooms, this house actually seems to have 23 rooms in it, which would make it the most of any Fremont house that's known. And the majority of the rooms never seem to have been used. They seem to just be there to look big, which is a very fascinating dynamic. So it seems like we have at most of these sites, we have at least one house that just looks unusual, looks big. Maybe sometimes they're trying to make it look even bigger than it is. That kind of has that visual factor to it. Okay, the next thing that we see at most Fremont Village sites is some sort of communal structure. And if it's not at every site, you have at least kind of regional or dispersed community structures where everybody in this first region might come and gather. We have this one right here. This is a large pit house. This is the largest pit house ever found. This is also at the same site. It's actually located right here, just west of the structure. Then we have some of these oversized pit structures. And then we also have surface structures that look unusual. They don't look like residences necessarily. They look like they may have been built and maintained by the entire community. So these are communal structures that can help integrate everybody living in these communities. And as far as villages, I'm going to go through a couple of villages just to show you kind of a typical pattern in Fremont villages. You have, again, the pit houses on the outskirts. You have this communal structure and an unusual residence. At Wolf Village, on the outskirts. So all around here, we have a few pit houses, and then we have this large communal structure and this unusual residence. This picture or this map is from not the most recent excavations. I think we had 7 rooms at this time, and again, we got up to 23 by the end of it. We have this unusual residence. Here at Paraguna, this is going to be right in that southern area of the Fremont region, right just north of the Virgin Branch Pueblo region. You have these kind of what seem to be probably communal storage structures. You have possibly a surface communal structure here, a communal plaza area. So even though all these villages look very different across the Fremont region, they have these patterns that unite them and show that there is something, some at least ideology that's tying together how a village should be formed. And the interesting thing about Paraguna that also ties us to the Southwest is that these structures right here are oriented towards either the sunrise on the winter solstice or the sunset on the summer solstice. And solstice markers are very important when we're looking at, we're talking about Southwest Pueblo cultures as well. So we're seeing that kind of coming into Fremont too. Very briefly, rock art. Rock art is found across the Fremont region. Fremont is known for their rock art. If you've ever been to 9 Mile Canyon, you've seen a lot of Fremont rock art. If you have a chance, I recommend going. We have this typical classic trapezoidal figure. We have him here and we have him down here. That's a very classic Fremont thing. And we also often have these little horns on them, which are probably headdresses. We actually have a few sites, cave sites, where perishables have been preserved, where we actually have evidence of some of these potential headdresses. And that's probably what these markers are. So I did watch an episode of Ancient Aliens one time that specifically talked about the Fremont, and they did in no uncertain terms tell me that it was clearly alien, obviously. And then I just want you to pay attention to this right here, just the way that his hand is displayed and his feet, because that's going to come into play later. Okay, figurines, kind of the same thing. There's one of the hallmarks that the early archaeologists mention about Fremont is this figurine cult, is what they call it. These are unbaked figurines, so they're not fired. However, oftentimes they are placed in houses, and those houses are then intentionally burned down, probably some sort of ritual closing ceremony. And then they fire in that act, and they preserve to stay. So we have a bunch of very beautiful examples. A lot of them are still trapezoidal, so they kind of hold that kind of same shape that we see in the rock art. And you can see some of them are more elaborate than others. It seems that there's kind of a divide, that in the northern Colorado Plateau, they seem to look a little different maybe than in the eastern Great Basin region. They seem to be a little more elaborate in the Colorado Plateau, I believe, and a little more simple in the Basin region. Okay, long distance trade really quickly, because it's interesting. We do have Olivella shell coming from Southern California in the Gulf down there, and that's being traded up into the Fremont region. We have evidence of that trade connection lasting hundreds of years. Even before kind of that classic Fremont period, we still see Olivella shell in the region. So we know they're participating in long distance trade. We also see turquoise, which is not native to that region. Some of it's probably coming from Nevada. The only time anybody's ever sourced any turquoise from the Fremont region, I believe, is from Five Finger Ridge. And what they discovered is that some of it's actually the same turquoise, or the same trade networks that are supplying Chaco with turquoise are also supplying some Fremont sites with turquoise. And so again, we have those Southwest connections in the Fremont. And I actually have a colleague who's hoping to be able to source more of these for her master's thesis. Okay, let's move on to ceramics. Ceramics that's my thing. That's my favorite. That's my specialty, I guess. I have been studying Fremont ceramics for, almost a decade now, which seems very bizarre. So ceramics also have this tie to the Southwest, obviously. Other groups in the area are not making ceramics like this. This is a very Southwestern way to make ceramics. We have the coil and scrape pottery, which is the type that we see in the Southwest. You can see here, you're making a coil, and then you'll scrape the coils away, and then you'll polish it. Just because while I was at Fremont Indian State Park yesterday, I found this jar that gave kind of a perfect example. I thought I'd show you guys. So you can see here that as they made these coils, the opening became too narrow and they couldn't reach in there and scrape it. So you can still see the coils on the outside here, or on the inside, sorry. Then on the outside, they've been completely scraped away. And then they would have taken a probably really polished rock or stone and polished the outside of these vessels. Now, even though this is a very, very probably northern southwest way of making pottery, they also still make it their own. So if you are familiar with pottery in the Southwest, you'll know that grayware in the Southwest typically is not polished. If it's painted, if the pottery is painted, it'll be polished. If it's not painted, probably not polished. But Fremont didn't buy into that. They didn't polish everything, but they polished a lot of things. It's not uncommon to find grayware that is highly polished like this here. Plain pottery is found as early as about AD 600. I would like to find those early dates and sites and redate them just to make sure, but that's about when we started seeing plain pottery, we think. And then painted pottery doesn't come on the scene until about AD 1000. And it's interesting because these designs have no antecedents in the Fremont region. So in the Southwest, you see this kind of evolution and development of pottery, where you have basket designs that then get translated to pottery, and then those pottery designs change into something more elaborate and different and distinctly, different Pueblo pottery type. But you don't see that in Fremont. There's no antecedent. It seems like Fremont pottery is showing up in the region as just a copy of what's happening in the Pueblo II period in the Southwest. And there's no painted pottery before that. It so clearly looks like Pueblo II stuff in the Southwest that I was working with my advisor, Andrew Duff, down in New Mexico, and I could identify the Pueblo II pottery in that region because anything that looked like Fremont was Pueblo II. So it has a very strong connection. Okay, so pottery is made in the Fremont region in 5 different zones, and we'll go through this very quickly. We tell them apart by the temper or the kind of the crushed rock inclusions that people add to the clay so it doesn't crack in the fire. However, painted ceramics are only made in 2 regions, down here in the Carolyn Valley and over here in the Emory region. And this is just examples of the variety of painted pottery that we can see. So we have just a plain bowl. This one has a little ridge to it. And then you have stuff like fry loaves and jars and things like that. It's interesting, though, because even though everybody here is making their own pottery, up here in the northern area, over here in the Uinta area, but instead of making their own painted pottery, they are instead traveling hundreds of miles to obtain painted pottery from very specific places. So people up here in the northern Salt Lake are traveling down to the Carolyn Valley to get pottery and taking it back. And you see similar patterns, but not quite as expansive here in this Emory region. And even honestly there isn't a lot of painted pottery over in the Uinta region, but there is some Snake Valley pottery. So they are even passing over this region, going here and bringing the pottery back. So there's a lot of implications to that and a lot of questions as to why. And that's one of the things I'm looking at in my dissertation is trying to understand why they would do that. Really quickly, there's different designs painted on Fremont bowls. However, most of them are banded like this. You can see these different banded designs. And these banded designs, while present in the Southwest, are there's usually a more expansive design in the Southwest. It seems like Fremont picked these 3 types of designs, the 2 types of bands, with this panel band, with this faux panel band that looks paneled but has no lines going directly from the top framing line to the bottom framing line, and this continuous band. And they decided that was the Fremont way of doing things, and you see that repeated over and over and over again. So you can see here the majority of all Fremont painted bowls, I think it's somewhere like 80% of all known Fremont painted bowls, follow this pattern of having either panels or undivided or continuous panel or full panel band. So it's a very tight design style that Fremont's following, and a lot of this is coming from a master's thesis. You also have different types of symmetry, which we won't go into right now, but just to show you that this rotational symmetry, especially since it's a banded design, it makes sense that rotational symmetry is very common in Fremont. So the conclusions of my master's thesis was basically that even though pottery is being made, painted pottery is being made in 2 different areas in the Southwest or in the Fremont region, that they're following a very strict and standardized design style that looks like it has elements and origins in the Southwest, but then was made to become something very distinctly Fremont. Oh, and this is just a fun 2-second distraction where I just want to show you guys some zomorphs. This is from Paragoona, 2 little horned critters. We have what I think is probably a lizard from Snake Rock. And I've looked at probably hundreds of thousands of Fremont sherds, and by far these two are my favorites because these are the only known anthropomorphs ever painted on a Fremont bowl. And as you can see the kind of splayed fingers. It looks very similar to that rock art I was showing you guys earlier. Okay, back to the other stuff. Okay, so in Fremont, we'll go over this very, very quickly. Because there's kind of that break between Fremont and the Southwest, and Fremont people looked more towards the Great Basin in the Southwest, you had a lot of people analyzing pottery for many years who didn't really know how to analyze pottery in the way that people do in the Southwest. And so you have people making these correlations between Fremont pottery and pottery in the Southwest, but they're definitely not experts in pottery in the Southwest. The only exception really is Ford and Tlister, who did know the Southwest pottery styles. And so you have people saying, suggesting that you have certain types of pottery, Sophie, Black Mesa, and Dagozi are the three most commonly cited types that Fremont seems to be most similar to. However, if you look at these potteries and look at the type of pottery and look at Fremont pottery, they're very, very different. Sophie is made up mostly of lines and triangles, and they have these more intricate designs. Fremont, typically, they have lines and triangles, but most pottery does. But they don't have the other type of elements that Fremont gets. Black Mesa is not a bad comparison. You have these interlocking scrolls, and you have some of the same elements. So that's actually what I'm being looking into in my dissertation. Dagozi is a weird choice because it's hatchered, and very few Fremont vessels have any hatchering on it. Instead of looking kind of more virgin and Kanta area, we want to look a little farther to the east and look at things like Red Mesa, possibly Cortez and White Mesa styles, which seem to have a lot more of the elements that we see present on Fremont. So things like these interlocking scrolls, these triangles in the corner of paneled elements, which you see here on White Mesa and over here on this Cortez vessel. And one of the things actually that I'm very interested in with Fremont is, I'm actually going to go back just 1 second, forgive me, is this idea of this bracketed interlocking scroll. Most of the vessels that I see in the Southwest have this interlocking scroll coming off into a triangle, but Fremont often, just as often as not, has it coming off into this bracket. And anybody is a Southwest archaeologist and knows of any areas of the Southwest that have that same design, I would be very interested in knowing about it. Okay. So these seem like they're correlates, and it looks like the best place to look for connections between Fremont and the Southwest is really going to be in the Four Corners area. So as far as boundary lands and borderlands in the Fremont, we have different kind of permeable boundaries. Even though Paraguna and this area here, and this is one of the hot spots where they're making painted pottery, is literally right just north of the Virgin region, it seems like the pottery design styles are not related to those in the Virgin region. Instead, it seems like they're coming from the design styles over here. And this seems to be a little bit of a harder boundary. Whereas over here, we have this area in such a place like Coos Village, where we have people who are both Fremont people and Pueblo people living in the same area at the same time. And we have both Fremont villages and Pueblo villages occupying the same space over here. So this area seems to have been more permeable, and it makes sense then that our design styles are coming from this area because it seems to be more of an area of influence. Oh, yeah, and the other thing really quickly is that this is one of the other really interesting things is that we have Pueblo pottery. You see it in the Fremont region, just not very often. You see some at Paraguna, I think probably more at Paraguna than anywhere else, but it's not really transferring north. There seems to be kind of almost a boundary here where you're not getting Pueblo pottery up into this region. And I mean, people are obviously willing to travel hundreds of miles to get painted pottery, but they're getting Fremont pottery and not Pueblo pottery. And that seems like either a very intentional choice on the people that maybe there's something significant about the pottery made by these individuals that they want to have, or it's possible that these guys want to protect their economic trade and they're kind of blocking the path here to get to these other pottery makers. Both those have been suggested. So just in conclusion here, a few things. One, that it seems like the Fremont has a very strong Southwest connection. It seems like there's a strong Southwest heritage in the Fremont region. However, despite us seeing very strong markers of the Southwest in the Fremont region, it seems that there are deliberate styles that they created that were distinctly Fremont and distinctly a rejection of what's happening in the Southwest. So as I was talking about that pottery, the native pottery, it looks very Pueblo too. But when Pueblo 2 pottery switches to Pueblo 3 pottery, and you start getting these new design styles that are distinctly Pueblo 3 in the Four Corners region, Fremont pottery still looks like it's a Pueblo 2 pottery. It's staying the same, or fairly the same, for a few hundred years. No, we need better dating at the sites to understand how the pottery is changing, but it doesn't change in the same way that things are changing in the Southwest. You have surface architecture, which is clearly coming from the Southwest. You have people making really big, great houses in their villages, just like people are making great houses in the Southwestern, the Pueblo 2 time period. But they're doing it in a very distinctly Fremont way. And so it seems in a lot of ways that the Fremont people are intentionally, I would say, and I would argue, creating this new negotiated identity when they're moving to this region. And that identity has a lot of roots in the Southwest, but I believe is being kept intentionally distinct from the Southwest to be something that is not Southwestern, that's something that is distinctly Fremont. And that would be recognizably distinctly Fremont if you're somebody from the outside coming in. And the last big conclusion is that there is a lot of work to do still in the Fremont region. And if you're interested in any of this, please tune in for my Lister Fellowship presentation when I'm finished with my dissertation, and hopefully have more answers and inevitably more questions as well. So I want to thank a lot of people, all of the individuals and institutions that have funded me, the museums that have let me in, especially during COVID. I've been very appreciative to any museums that have let me do some research, and to all these individuals, especially my dissertation committee, and all the people who have just helped me on this journey. So thank you.
Great presentation. And some of that I have just never seen before. So it was really exciting. I have to go look up the figurines, the Fremont figurines, and the picture of corn you showed was what people in the Southwest will call corn on a stick, except it had kernels on it. And I just really want to look up that publication that was in. That's great. Thank you, Katie. We've got loads of questions. People have really been sending them in at the end, and I'm going to try my best to organize them. But maybe it's best to start with the end. Where did Fremont people go? And do any contemporary Native groups consider Fremont to be their ancestors?
That is a very good question. And yes, a lot of groups consider Fremont to be their ancestors. And there's a lot of hypotheses. There's a lot of groups that live in modern tribes that live in Utah that claim Fremont as their ancestors. There's also a lot of Pueblo groups that claim Fremont as their ancestors, because we can see there is a strong Pueblo connection. Scott Ortman has recently done a lot of research using his more like linguistic stuff, and he suggests that maybe some of the Fremont people, at least in the eastern area, and I think I'm getting this right, went off to the Plains area and became Plains people. So the answer is, in short, that we don't necessarily know for sure who are the descendants of Fremont people, but there are a lot of people who claim and have a good claim to Fremont. I believe that Fremont, as far as NAGPRA, or the law about repatriating, is concerned, I believe they're still unaffiliated, though there are multiple groups that will claim them. I think we have repatriated things to different groups who claim them.
Got it. Thank you. So, okay, now let's go back to the beginning of Fremont. I'm fairly convinced by even your preliminary analysis of design elements on ceramics that there seems to be a strong connection to Pueblo II pottery styles, right? So I've got a couple questions about that. One is, what are the specific ways that we see Fremont ceramic styles go from that point? Do they go in some divergent ways from the Central Mesa Verde types? That's the first question. And somebody else was asking about kill holes in Fremont pottery, sometimes in in the Southwest. You know what they are. Maybe you can describe them too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hopefully I can do it justice.
Yeah,
You see, you see them all, I think, in Membranes region, where at the end of the use life of a pot, you'll put a kill hole in the bottom of it as kind of a symbolic way of killing the pot and letting the spirit out of the pot. You don't see that in the Fremont region, as far as I can tell. There aren't very many whole vessels, though. As far as complete, never broken vessels, maybe 10. Reconstructed vessels that are more than 50%, at least enough I can get a design analysis off of, about 110. So we're not talking about a lot of vessels here, which makes it difficult to look at some of those changes. And with the problems with chronology, it's also hard to look at those changes through time. I will say that it seems to me that Fremont pottery designs are staying fairly stagnant. That while McElmo and Mesa Verde types are coming in P3 period, that's not happening in Fremont. And I think it's a very deliberate way of holding on to their past and their heritage of when they really became the kind of true classic Fremont people, and that they're using that as a symbol of identity through this entire time. And that's more, I need to do more research on that. That's kind of the feeling that I'm getting, though. But we're not seeing distinct changes or really strong changes in design style over time.
Oh, that's neat. Good stuff.
It's very different than the Southwest.
Yeah. The first village that you showed in your presentation, five ridges?
Finger Ridge. Finger Ridge.
Right. One of our listeners really noted that's it appears to be a pretty defensible site. Do you see any evidence for defensiveness as being important, especially to those early Fremont settlers, in choosing site locations? And maybe you can just talk a little bit about evidence for warfare and defensiveness among Fremont people.
It's a very good question, one that hasn't really been examined very well. And I'll start with that. I don't know that anybody's really ever looked for defensibility on these sites before. That one is very defensible. It is on that ridge. But I don't think most Fremont Village sites, I don't think you would look at them as being in locations as being defensible. They're mostly in locations that make sense for farming. Okay. I will say that, and I think this isn't a published article, which is why I'm saying it, that there is some processed human remains in a lot of Fremont villages that are found scattered at the bottoms of pit houses. Whether that's violence or something else, it's hard to know. We also don't, one of the weird things about Fremont is we don't know where their burials are. There are very few Fremont burials that have ever been found. Occasionally they'll be in a pit house or be in a village, but not nearly enough bodies or burials have been found in villages to explain the houses that are in those villages. And so I think the kind of short answer to all of it is that we don't really necessarily know much about violence and warfare in the region. I think there has been a study, I think Aaron Woods and some other colleagues at UNLV did a study on it a few years ago, and it's been too long. I'd have to refresh myself on it to give you a better answer.
Got it. People were really interested in all aspects of your presentation, but you piqued their interest when you were talking about food and agriculture. So a couple questions about food. Did Fremont people irrigate their maize fields? Do we have any evidence for water control?
Yes, we do. Not a lot. I'm going to get it wrong. It's either one of the very early, I'll just say one of the early Fremont sites with corn at it has evidence for irrigation. Okay. And there's a few other sites, a couple in central Utah, that also have evidence for irrigation. I think, and Steve Sims and some colleagues at Utah State University have actually been doing more research on this and have been finding evidence for irrigation canals. We don't, and the question is not necessarily are they, it's hard to know if they're not common or if it's just that we're not finding them because we don't have extensive survey and don't have extensive excavations going on. And so they could be there. We also don't really know where their fields are. I don't think many people have ever really excavated something they consider to be a Fremont field. But that's just more of the state of Fremont excavations than anything else. So yes, they are irrigating. We don't know a ton about it though.
Got it. Right about this time, people in the central Mesa Verde area who had turkeys for a long time start eating their turkeys. Do we have evidence that the Fremont people raised turkeys? Do we ever find turkeys?
Wish.
I wish to.
No, there's no evidence for Fremont turkeys. It would be really cool, though.
Huh. That's sort of fascinating. Just thinking about the timing of it.
Yeah.
Let me see what other questions we have here. Oh, one has to do with other things that Fremont people might have been bringing with them from say the Central Mesa Verde region. And one person asked, Sunny, asked whether there's an astronomic orientation to their households or villages, whether we see any of those sorts of alignments that, by 1000 in the Central Mesa Verde region were important.
That is an excellent question, and something actually that Jim Allison, Lindsay Johansson, and I have been trying to do some research on recently. Yes and no. It seems like there are some very strong orientations in the Fremont region, but they're not consistent. So like I was saying, down at that southern Utah site of Paraguna, you have strong solstice orientations. And that site seems to interestingly be located directly east of this place called the Parowan Gap, which seems to be a natural solstice marker. That if you were to stand in the middle of the gap during the sunrise on the winter solstice, and I can say this is true because I did it last winter solstice, even though it was 10 degrees outside and my toes went numb, you can watch the sunrise over right in the middle of that gap. And then you can watch the sun set in the gap on the other side during the summer solstice. And so it seems that down in that region, you have this strong solstice, the solstice markering that you see in other places in the Southwest. When you go up there to, what side am I thinking of? Wolf Village, where that massive pit structure is and that house with 20 some odd rooms, you actually see a very strong north-south orientation with everything. It was confusing sometimes because there would be vent shafts on the exact same easting line, and people would yell at the numbers. I was like, oh no, that's wrong, and realized I was talking about their vent shaft on the other side of the site, not my vent shaft on my area of the site. So you have this very strong north-south orientation. There's an argument at Baker Village, which is that one that's located in eastern Nevada, that is oriented towards different solstice markers as well. But this is really something that people haven't looked into much, and it's something that Jim and I especially are very interested in and would like to do more research on. But it seems that there are definitely intentional orientations in the Fremont region, but it's not consistent across the region.
Got it. Cool. Thank you. Let me go over to Facebook and make sure that I don't have any good questions here. I don't see any. People haven't been asking questions over there. We've got a question from Marilyn about those distant objects, Olivella shells, other artifacts that are found at Fremont sites. She just asked a general question, and it just piqued my interest, and I don't know the answer to it. So you probably don't either, but I'd like your thoughts on it. I mean, we don't know. Why Olivella shells? Why are they so widespread in the Southwest? She says, is it just easy to make beads and string the shell together as decoration, or for some other region, connection to the ocean possibly? She's from California, so she's curious. What have you read? I haven't read enough about Olivella shells.
I haven't read a lot either. I was reading a little bit for a paper that Jim and I are working on. But I didn't see any reasons for it. That's a really good question, and I feel like it's one that I should have thought about earlier. So thank you for asking it. I don't know. I feel like partly this kind of became this prestige item that maybe just people kept on copying because somebody else had it. But it's hard to know for sure exactly why they would have had it. But it is across the Southwest, and it's pretty common in the Fremont region. And I don't know how many we have up at Wolf Village, but in that big central structure, I'm gonna knock on the door and tell me I'm wrong about this, but I think we might have had over 100 in that structure of those shell beads in there. So for whatever reason, they're very into their Olivella shell beads.
Wow, yeah, that's incredible.
Do you have any thoughts on that? I'm curious to know if you have any different thoughts.
I actually don't know. Other than perhaps migration stories of contemporary Pueblo people about traveling to the Pacific Coast. I simply just haven't read enough about it to know. It's fascinating.
Good question.
We've got one last question, and then we're going to be up on our time. But we actually got it from multiple people. The paint that's used on the ceramics, mineral or carbon paint?
Yes, I was going to mention this and I forgot.
And can you describe for people what I mean by that? Yeah.
Yes. So there's different ways you can make paint for painting pottery. One is you're taking minerals and carbon and mixing that in to make paint. The other one is to use organic materials, typically beesweed is one of the common ones, and you're mixing that to make your paint. So at the end, you can have the same looking result on the pottery. The mineral, there's going to be slight differences. If you look at it, you can usually tell if it's mineral or organic paint, but from a distance, it's still going to have kind of a similar effect. But a lot of it is just kind of how you learn how to make paint, and that's kind of an important thing. We see a lot of that in the Southwest. You see kind of important transitions from going from mineral to organic, organic to mineral, showing distinct transitions. In Fremont, everything for the most part seems to be organic. We've actually just to double check. I was talking to Jeff Ferguson at the Murr Lab in Missouri, and he was telling us how to just double check with a PXRF machine. And we did that, and yeah, it looks like Fremont almost entirely using mineral paint.
Got it. Well, thank you so much, Katie, for giving this talk. I found it fascinating because I don't know as much as I realize I want to about the Fremont culture. So thank you so much. And everybody, please join us next week for somebody whose name has made a lot, been referenced a lot in this, Jim Allison, talking about his recent research down in the Four Corners region. Thank you so much, Katie, and good luck with the rest of your dissertation work.
Thank you. Thanks for Canyon, and thanks everyone for listening.
Bye, everyone.